Week 2, Supply and Demand Side Considerations. Left-wing populism. Recap of last week. Left-wing populism and right-wing populism are two distinct political ideologies that have gained popularity in recent years. While both forms of populism share some characteristics, they differ significantly in their approach to economics, social issues, and political power. Left-wing populism is associated with progressive movements that aim to address income inequality, social injustice, and economic disparity. These movements, led by figures such as Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the United States, focus on issues such as raising the minimum wage, providing universal health care, and free education. Left-wing populists tend to oppose corporations and wealthy elites, while advocating for workers' rights and progressive taxation policies. Right-wing populism is associated with conservative movements that prioritize nationalism, immigration control, and traditional social values. Figures such as Donald Trump in the United States and Marine Le Pen in France have promoted a populist agenda that focuses on issues such as building a border wall, limiting immigration, and promoting a return to traditional values. Right-wing populists often claim to represent the silent majority and seek to disrupt the established political order. Studying populism, ideology, strategy, discourse, performance. Locke's definition of populism as multi-class movement for equality. Muddy's definition of populism as thin-centered ideology. Muller's definition of populism as anti-pluralist identity politics. Relationship between democracy and populism, inclusive versus exclusive. Material, symbolic, political inclusion and exclusion. Populist mobilization, leadership, social movement, parties. Demand and supply side factors. Disaffection, unresponsiveness, party convergence, electoral system, issue. Framing hypotheses on the rise of populism, post-industrial transformation of society, globalization and neoliberalism, the changing role of the media, shocks and crises, GPS as an example of measuring populism globally, plan for the week, providing an overview of some of the major explanations put forward to explain left-wing populism, providing the definition of left-wing populism, outlining the key characteristics of left-wing populism cross-nationally, examining the rise of the populist left in Europe, examining the rise of the populist left in Latin America, conceptualizing left-wing populism. Chantal Mouffe on left-wing populism. Left-wing populism as a response to the populist moment, a crisis of neoliberal hegemony which demands the establishment of a more democratic order given the erosion of two pillars of democracy, equality and popular sovereignty. The post-democracy era originating in the Reagan and Thatcher revolutions has led to a process of disaffection with democracy and institutions marked by rising levels of voter abstention and rising levels of support for right-wing populist parties. Post-democracy refers to the contemporary vision of liberal democracy which now focuses solely on free elections, where economic liberalism and the free market have come to constitute its key political and economic tenets, applies equally to global North and South contexts. This has led to a simultaneous, post-politics era marked by the erosion of differences between the major left and the right parties. Mouffe on left-wing populism. The global financial crisis of 2008 revealed the contradictions within the neoliberal economic paradigm and has ushered in demands for anti-establishment and pro-democratic movements. The 2008 crisis as an interim, a term used by Gramsci to characterize a period of crisis in which the theoretical foundations of an established ideology of a hegemonic project are challenged. Post-2008 era considered an era of resurgent populism globally. For Mouffe, left-wing populism is best understood as a discursive strategy of populism which establishes its political frontiers on the conflict between the people and the oligarchy with the goal of Deepening democracy. The populist movement is characterized by an emerging set of demands that no longer correspond to definitive social categories. Defending the environment, addressing issues of sexism, racism, and other forms of discrimination. It is through the use of democracy as a hegemonic signifier under a left-wing populist banner that a chain of equivalence between different groups seeking change can be established. The main axis of political conflict in the populist movement is the struggle for power between the forces of the populist right and the populist left. It is through the adoption of a concept of the people rooted in the mobilization of actors seeking to defend equality and social justice that serves as the best means to combat the xenophobic and authoritarian policy agendas of the radical right. Both the populist left and right have risen to prominence as a result of the key post-democratic condition, the growing oligarchization of society and the financialization of the economy. Right-wing populists claim to restore popular sovereignty and democracy through the construction of an exclusionary notion of the people. Left-wing populists claim to recover and deepen democracy through unifying a set of diverse actors under a common cause of combating the oligarchy and the economic system which has perpetuated its existence. Therefore, left-wing populism can be conceived of as a class-based movement that draws largely on a socio-economic messaging but that also attempts to unite and represent a diverse electorate with unique demands. Using this tactic. Explanations of populism on the left. Although there are a variety of approaches to left-wing populism, the most common feature shared among all variants is a rejection of neoliberalism as the core economic model for society and the pursuing of alternatives to this system, to varying degrees. This feature of left-wing populism is shared cross-nationally in both Europe and especially in Latin America. Although countries in both continents have a strong tradition of left-wing populist politics, the prevalence of this phenomenon has substantially increased in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis. Three factors have been proposed to explain the rise of left-wing populist backlash. Oscar Garcia 2020. The first is a crisis of the party system in which the decline of mainstream parties has led to the emergence of new party families. The second is rooted in the populist notion of a pure people and corrupt elite. Corruption is perceived of as the dependency of an relationship between elected representatives and those who fund their campaigns. The third is the increasing prevalence of political movements which can act as the spark for the emergence of new and success of existing left-wing populist parties, e.g. anti-austerity movements in Europe following 2008. The first factor of a crisis within the party system draws attention to the cartelization of political parties, Katzenmeyer 2018, which contributes to the erosion of major differences between political parties. Focus is on the increasingly close relationship between parties and the state. Given that parties are increasingly funded by the state, they tend to reproduce the same set of behaviors to remain in power regardless of ideology. In their collaborations with one another as well as with the state, cartel parties cease to represent the demands of their constituencies and function mainly to retain elected office and power. This process in turn creates dissatisfaction among the electorate and raises the demand for new parties from outside the system. The second factor which can contribute to the rising prominence of left-wing populism is the increasingly close relationship and dependency of the government on economic interests. The understanding of corruption by populist left parties is not limited solely to the violation of laws on the part of the elite, but on the economic capture of democratically elected representatives and institutions which are co-opted by an elite that then uses its influence to represent its own interests over those of voters. The effect of corruption on the emergence of party alternatives is two Pronged, it entails bad governance, i.e. parties which do not represent the interests of voters, and declining levels of trust, i.e. lower levels of participation in the political process, and a lack of faith in democratic institutions. In the North American, and especially in the U.S. context, the emerging mechanism that has led to a similar set of dynamics is the extensive role that money plays in the electoral sphere over time, and especially since the 2010 Citizens United ruling in the U.S. Any limits on campaign contributions have essentially been lifted, and individuals as well as groups are able to spend unlimited sums of money to support the candidates they prefer in both local and national elections. This has been argued to have resulted in a situation where wealthy elites have increasingly seen their policy goals adopted by the party system, whereas ordinary voters are left out of the political process. The potential for such a system to incentivize the emergence of a left-wing populist movement is best captured by Bernie Sanders' 2016 run for president. The third factor is the increasing prevalence of social movements and protests, especially in times of crisis, which bring attention to the failures of the political and economic system. Such conditions not only provide an opportunity for existing political parties to respond to the demands of the electorate, but also provide opportunities for social movements themselves to become political parties. In the European case, the post-2008 global financial crisis era has been characterized by large-scale anti-austerity movements which have created left-wing populist party alternatives that have proven electorally successful, e.g. Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain. In the Latin American case, the post-1990s resurgence of the left as well as the post-2008 era have also witnessed large anti-neoliberal social movements which have propelled left-wing populists across the region into political office, e.g. in Ecuador, Venezuela, and Bolivia. Together, these set of factors highlight the key contextual condition for the rise of left-wing populism, a crisis of representation. Critiques from the populist left are often focused on the established party system and the ways in which it has been captured by neoliberal policies into self-serving and corrupt elite. At the heart of left-wing populism is the problematizing and seeking of alternatives to the increasingly close relationship between democracy and neoliberalism. Left-wing populists add a new dimension of democracy versus neoliberalism to the existing left-right cleavage, a definition of left-wing populism. Together, these factors provide for a definition of left-wing populism as outlined by Oscar Garcia, 2020. Left-wing populism can be understood as the combination of a populist impetus and the desire for expanding democratic representation through appeal to the people against the elites, and the left-wing tradition of promoting equality and social justice. In contrast to populism on the right, the pursuit of egalitarianism is the central principle of populism on the left. The focus of left populists on the expansion of democratic participation is as integral to their project as the concepts of the people and the elite are to populism. Historically, the focus of left-wing populism has largely been confined to a critique of the neoliberal economic order, given its inherently political nature. Contemporary left-wing populism's push for greater representation includes a variety of issues which have become increasingly important to its cause, e.g. gender equality, immigration, climate change, and the advancement of human rights. Over time, the focus of left populism has shifted away from a purely economic-oriented critique of neoliberalism to a more expansive movement for democratic expansion, aims at providing democratic rights and freedoms to historically oppressed and marginalized communities that fall outside of traditional class-based cleavages or that may cut across class lines. Characteristics of left-wing populism. Ultimately, contemporary left-wing populism entails three major characteristics. Oscar Garcia, 2020. The first is transversality, where the goal of achieving greater levels of representation requires the agendas and proposals of left-wing populists to go beyond the typical left versus right dichotomy which has historically defined the electoral and political domains, e.g. democracy versus neoliberalism. The second is inclusiveness, where the goal of advocating for the representation of a plurality of diverse interests in society requires that populism breaks free from its conceptualization as an inherently anti-pluralist phenomenon, e.g. mobilization beyond class identity. The third is participation, where direct democratic participation and representation are key aspects to facilitating trust between voters and elected representatives. Left-wing populism and the socialist tradition. One prominent argument which has been made regarding the nature of left-wing populism is that it is heavily influenced by socialist traditions, given that socialism itself has often been regarded as intrinsically populist in nature. March 2007. For much of the 20th century, socialist parties have attempted to mobilize voters using a class-based strategy that draws on the Marxist tradition of the struggle of the proletariat against the bourgeoisies. For instance, Locke has regarded socialism as the highest form of populism. Although the tradition of left-wing populism is derived from a socialist past, these movements now are less concerned with doctrinal purity and class consciousness and the mobilization of the working class. What contemporary populist movements on the left have done is to expand this proletarian struggle for emancipation to include a broader, national people who share a common liberation interest. Their focus is increasingly on an inclusive agenda of egalitarianism in which economic and class-based issues and interests play a central but not the only role. As well, the radicalism of these movements vary, with some supportive of working within the system to advocate for their cause, e.g. in Europe, and others supportive of system overthrow, e.g. in Latin America. The contemporary advocacy of left-wing populists for more substantive representation is rooted in its broader critique of liberal democracy. March 2007. Populists on the left are generally hostile to the idealized notions of liberal and representative democracy, given that they have largely resulted in a representation gap in which many people feel increasingly less represented within the system, i.e. crisis of representation. In this sense, populism can be seen as democracy's shadow, given the large gap between liberal democracy's promise and its reality, which has given rise to a flurry of populist dissatisfaction and mobilization. The democratic vision of left populists is also rooted in a notion of economic democracy, which also has strong roots in socialist thought. The term economic democracy has been used to refer to an economic system that is concerned with the creation of a society oriented towards achieving human equality and social justice, as opposed to one that is concerned with the generation of profits and wealth maximization. Such a system is meant to ensure that all citizens, regardless of their socioeconomic status, are provided with the basic necessities of life so that they will subsequently be able to engage in the market economy, as opposed to a system based on an unfettered market economy that seeks to subordinate all aspects of life to the profit motive. Left-wing populism in Europe. In the European context, left-wing populist parties came to prominence in the 1990s, partly because of the new politics era, in which rising levels of disaffection with mainstream parties emerged, with the claim of representing ordinary people who had been abandoned by the party system. The argument that mainstream parties had sold out to the establishment and had abandoned their supporters was one of the key driving forces for the rising levels of support for both left and right-wing populist parties during this period. Part of the populist backlash in this period is rooted in the rising prominence of third-way approaches adopted by major parties in the aftermath of the decline of the Keynesian economic consensus and the transition to the neoliberal economic model. Specifically, The shift from a growth-oriented model focused on the policy goal of full employment and the demand-side management of the economy to one characterized by the policy goal of low inflation and to supply-side management of the economy has resulted in a convergence in the agendas of mainstream parties. Voters negatively influenced by these changes increasingly looked for alternative sources of political representation. The changes and shift towards the economic right on the part of social democratic parties is especially important for the rise of left-wing populist alternatives. Electoral performance of social democratic parties in 31 countries over time. Source: Benedetto et al. 2020. The Rise and Fall of Social Democracy 1918-2017. American Political Science Review, 114 3. 928-939. Social Democratic Vote and Income Inequality, 1965-2019. Source: Matthew Polacco. 2021. The rightward shift and electoral decline of social democratic parties under increasing inequality. West European Politics, 45 4. 665-692. The rise of left-wing populism. Additionally, the collapse of communism provided another opening for the populist left in the 1990s, with the fall of major communist parties as viable left-wing alternatives and the rightward shift of social democratic parties such as the German SPD and British Labour. Parties of the populist left filled a gap within the electoral sphere by positioning themselves as the newly emerging alternatives on the left. These changes within the party structure allowed for populist alternatives to paint the major parties as part of the establishment and therefore as the enemy. The concept of a heartland became an important element of left-wing populist ideology, which aimed to present an idealized model of social democracy prior to the influences of the neoliberal paradigm and the betrayal of major parties of the electorate. Another factor which played a role in the rise of the populist left in Europe is the expansion of the European Union (EU), which is seen by both left-wing and right-wing populist parties as a potential source of threat, but for different reasons. For the populist left, EU expansion at the time came to be correlated with rising levels of socio-economic insecurity and expansion of neoliberal capitalist globalization, which subjects national politics to international economic forces. Lastly, another factor which has been argued to support the rise of the populist left in Europe has been the increasing prevalence of regional and international crises and rising levels of inequality since the 1990s, much of which has been associated with an increasingly unstable political economy and subsequent rising levels of anti-capitalist attitudes. The 2008 crisis is the most recent example of such a crisis that has a significant impact on the electoral fortunes of the populist left. The contemporary populist left in Europe. In the contemporary European context, parties of the populist left have largely retained their focus on a capital-labor dichotomy in their interpretation of a top versus bottom conflict. However, they have increasingly shifted away from defining the people as solely consisting of the working class and the elite as solely consisting of business forces. Damiani 2018. Rather, these parties now identify the people as a large and diverse constituency that extends well beyond workers and does not revolve around the centrality of this electorate in their focus on incorporating a plurality of interests and social categories in a campaign of fighting social exclusion. As well, the elite have come to increasingly include mainstream parties and the established party system and party structure itself rather than just domestic and international capitalists. Three of the most successful modern populist left parties, Podemos, Syriza, France Insoumise, provide examples of these tactics. All three parties initially mobilized their electorates around an anti-austerity platform, an anti-center left and center-right movement critical of political elites, but also an agenda dedicated to social inclusivity and social justice. This new approach on the part of the populist left in Europe can best be understood by its break from traditional left-wing politics characteristic of the 20th century. In particular, Populist left parties have identified a new, historical bloc as their reference point for the electorates they seek to mobilize. Damiani 2018. The concept of a historical bloc adopted by George Sorel and used by Antonio Gramsci refers to the partnership between different social forces who come together to achieve a common goal of establishing the structural, i.e. economic, and superstructural, i.e. political, cultural, ideal, and moral hegemony needed to govern a political community. In the traditional Gramscian view, the historical bloc of the proletarian working class is the key actor which must establish this hegemonic project in order to supplant the rule and established order of the industrial bourgeoisie or economic elite. This idea is rooted in the Marxian notion of a dictatorship of the proletariat, although such class-based worldview continues to animate the contemporary populist left in Europe. These parties have reconfigured their understanding of the historical bloc of voters needed to pursue social change, and, rather than a takeover of the state, these parties increasingly present themselves as the saviors of social democracy. One example of the changing mindset of the populist left when it comes to the formulation of this new historical bloc can be reflected in Pablo Iglesias, the former leader of Podemos' use of the term trauma. Damiani 2018. This term was used during Podemos' first campaign as a way of describing the economic, political, and cultural power centers throughout society which together constitute the elite that must be resisted. The key task of the populist left has been to formulate a new democratic agenda dedicated to radical pluralism as the best means through which to represent the general will of a new historical bloc that is identified by their oppression at the hands of a collective trauma. The principle of democracy is therefore the key defining feature of the new populist left in their advocacy for the expansion of democratic rights and participation. This focus on democracy is rooted in the notion of democratizing democracy, which involves a coupling of both the traditional institutions of representative democracy, i.e. elections, with the institutions of direct democracy, i.e. referenda, plebiscites, local level government councils, worker co-ops. The objective of this model is to return the direct powers of intervention to the people as a way of combating the increasing elitism and professionalization of politics. In addition to democracy, another important aspect in the creation of the populist left's historical bloc is their emerging set of reference values. These include anti-war and pacifism, nonviolence in the pursuit of political goals, feminism in paying attention to and addressing issues relating to gender equality and parity for people of different sexual orientations, the recognition of both civil and citizenship rights for historically marginalized communities, e.g. migrants and LGBTQ individuals, protection of the environment and a transition towards a green economy. Ultimately, the agenda of the contemporary populist left in Europe can be characterized by the kind of inclusionary populism we have discussed. These parties now aim to broaden the scope of democratic rights and participation to those who have been excluded from this process in many ways that go beyond traditional class cleavages and that embrace pluralism. Most of these parties remain committed to the incorporation of the new historical bloc within the fullest model of social democracy. Key features of the European populist left. Defining features of the contemporary European populist left. Oscar Garcia 2020. The first is that it seeks to be an alternative to social democracy. The second is that it seeks to be an alternative to right-wing populism. The third is that it has been utilized by parties of the center-left. The fourth is that it relies on charismatic relationship. And the fifth is that they represent movement parties, alternative to social democracy, as evidenced in the transition toward third-way politics among social democratic parties across Europe and the decline of mainstream parties. More broadly, the crisis of social democracy has incentivized the emergence of movements and political parties seeking to supplant it. The possibility that social democratic parties can become increasingly less relevant over time provides parties of the populist left with the potential to mobilize an electorate large enough to overtake the mainstream left. Several of these parties, as we will discuss, have adopted this exact notion. by positioning themselves as the parties most capable of redefining social democracy. Here, the goal is to save social democracy both by reaffirming its historically key tenets but also ultimately supplanting it with a new vision for political and economic democracy. Alternative to right-wing populism, the decline of social democratic parties has also incentivized the emergence of other party families such as the populist right, which have also attempted to mobilize disaffected voters. Currently, right-wing populist parties are far more influential across Europe than left-wing populist parties. Given the striking degree of difference in the agendas of the populist left and right, left-wing populist parties also seek to provide an alternative direction for Europe that moves away from the divisive and harmful agendas of the radical right, e.g. Greece and Spain. Recall Mao's claim that the post-democracy era is characterized by the fight between populist left and populist right used by the center-left. The degree to which left-wing populism has become an element within the mainstream left also varies by country. Perhaps the most prominent example here is of the British Labour Party under the former leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. Although Labour is a center-left party, the tenure of Corbyn witnessed rising levels of populist rhetoric within the party, and Corbyn himself has been regarded as a left-wing populist leader. For instance, Corbyn's agenda and rhetoric was very much devoted to a people-elite dichotomy largely revolving around British workers in a fight against both neoliberalism and austerity while attempting to reverse third-way politics within the party dating back to the Tony Blair era. Charismatic leadership, much like their Latin American counterparts, the success of left-wing populism in Europe also relies heavily on charismatic leaders who are willing to lead a movement as a political party. Prominent examples include both Alexis Tsipras and Pablo Iglesias in Greece and Spain, who led Syriza and Podemos to historic electoral victories. It is arguably true that the major left-wing populist movements over the past decade in Europe would not have been successful without the influence of the leaders which spearheaded the movement parties. Lastly, left-wing populism in the European context can be characterized as emerging from large-scale social movements demanding political representation. By far the most influential movements to have emerged in recent history are those in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis, which have promoted the politics of anti-austerity and the renewal of social democracy. Several of these movements have resulted in important electoral victories for parties of the populist left, e.g. in France, Spain, and Greece. Supporters of the populist left in Europe, although there are a variety of findings which have identified some of the key determinants of support for left-wing populist parties in Europe, some have more consistently been documented than others. In general, these parties have attracted the votes of constituencies that are consistent with the new globalization cleavage. Sanada and Rama 2018 studies have found that younger voters with higher levels of education and those who reside in urban city centers are more likely to support left-wing populist parties compared with right-wing populist parties. Fernandez Alberto's 2015 Orioles and Cordero 2016. The so-called losers of globalization who are most negatively impacted by this phenomenon have increasingly tended to support populist parties on the right. Individuals in this group typically include those with blue-collar backgrounds, particularly in manual occupations, the unemployed or underemployed, and older, less educated voters. In contrast, the winners of globalization are more likely to support green, liberal, and mainstream center-left parties such as social democratic parties. Increasingly, skepticism towards the EU has also been predictive of support for the populist left. Any questions, comments on left-wing populism in the European case? Left-wing populism in Latin America. The rise of populism in Latin America. The strongest historical traditions of left-wing populism are most prominent in Latin America, and the region today continues to be the site of some of the strongest populist left movements in the world. The combination of historically higher levels of socioeconomic inequality in the region partly account for why left-wing populism has generally been a staple of the political sphere for some time. Mudd and Kaltwasser 2017. Waves of populism. Broadly speaking, Latin America has experienced three waves of populist movements in its modern history: Mud and Saltwater 2017. The first was with the onset of the Great Depression in 1929, which lasted until the 1960s. In this period, the region was experiencing a crisis of incorporation in which rising rates of migration from rural to urban areas and the implementation of economic agendas dedicated to industrialization led to the emergence of demands for social and political rights. This was the initial era of leftist populism in countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Ecuador. During this period, the people was largely defined as the peasant and working classes, whereas the elite was largely defined as a national oligarchic class that was subservient to international capitalist forces. Waves of populism. This was the era of import substitution industrialization, ISI. In several countries, the ISI model came to be associated with a nationalistic leftist agenda which advocated for socio-economic development through state-led initiatives alongside social democratic reforms. As part of this model, the predominant model of political organization was through mass populist parties, often led by charismatic leaders, e.g. Perón in Argentina and Allende in Chile, who headed social movements which typically revolved around a fluid and unstable coalition of trade unions and different factions within the electorate. During this era, the Latin American populist left strongly pushed and was supportive of the notion that class consciousness and politics is the predominant cleavage along which the electorate should mobilize. The conflict lines in Latin American society revolved to a great degree on the labor-capital cleavage. The second wave of populism in the region emerged in the early 1990s as a result of economic crises towards the end of the 1980s, when populist leaders were able to achieve electoral victories by blaming the elite who had robbed nations of their sovereignty. Mud and Saltwater 2017. Populist leaders in this second wave of populism, e.g. Alberto Fujimori in Peru, largely implemented neoliberal policies of austerity in cooperation with international organizations such as the IMF and World Bank in their support of structural adjustment policies. In contrast to the first wave of ISI populism, the elite in this wave came to constitute the political class who favored a centralized state and opposed free markets, whereas the people played a less influential role in the political sphere, which was increasingly dominated by technocrats. This second wave was characterized by an elite-driven backlash to the highly state-centric and isolationist model of the ISI era. Waves of populism. The third wave of populism was ushered in with the 1998 victory of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, which subsequently spread to a number of countries, e.g. Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua. This wave is characterized by an anti-neoliberal, anti-American populism rooted in 21st century socialism. Mud and Saltwater 2017. All populist leaders in this wave regard themselves as radical leftists dedicated to fighting against excessive free market reforms and neoliberalism with the aim of uplifting the poorest in society. Most radical of all left populists globally. For this wave of populist leaders, the people has constituted all those who have been exploited and discriminated against, whereas the elite has constituted a domestic and international financial elite which has rigged the game in its own favor, as well as increasingly hostile Western powers with imperialist ambitions. These populist leaders have been committed, to varying degrees, to the expansion of democratic rights and the establishment of participatory democracy. The rise of populism in Latin America. The higher prevalence of left-wing populism in Latin America relative to the European continent is rooted in a number of important contextual factors. March 2007. First, the mass party model, which has characterized the European electoral system for much of the 20th century, was not the predominant model of political organization in Latin America, which has consisted for the most part of personalistic leadership. Second, the wave of enfranchisement of the 20th century in the region provided for the mass mobilization of previously excluded electorates. The third is that the nationalistic development models adopted by governments in the region have encouraged a leftist populist resurgence and the rise of delegative democracy models. There is also a wide variety of contemporary left-wing populist regimes in the region, with some in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Argentina characterized as populist regimes which are radically opposed to neoliberalism and free trade and that combine an anti-elitist, personalist, and classically populist tactic of governance, and others in Brazil and Chile, with the exception of the current president of Chile, which have historically been characterized by neoliberal reforms and pragmatic relationships with the international economic system. Ultimately, the rise of the Latin American populist left can be attributed to several factors: March 2007, high levels of social inequality, disillusionment with neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus, the decision by the left to accept electoral politics as the means through which to pursue change, the weakening of support for center-right parties, resurgent support for the left in the aftermath of the Cold War, anti-imperial struggle given the continent's history with colonial powers, the struggle for indigenous rights, social inequality. Historically speaking, the region has had some of the highest levels of social inequality in the world. This continues to be the case today. History of colonialism and the influence of colonial institutions on long-term development. Emergence of neoliberalism. Dependency theory. Disillusionment with neoliberalism. The post-1973 era of increasing economic liberalization has resulted in large-scale material deprivation for many countries in the region. Rising demand for more redistribution and social services and land reform. Undermining of indigenous rights and seizing of lands for international natural resource extraction. Rising levels of neo-patrimonial rule and state corruption. Electoral politics. The institutionalization of electoral politics and the use of elections as the main way through which to organize the political sphere provided new party families like the populist left with the ability to compete for office, a process from which they were previously excluded from. This, coupled with declining levels of support for center-right parties, provided new opportunities for parties to craft new electoral coalitions. Resurgent support for the left, as argued by Levitsky and Roberts, 2011, the 21st century has witnessed a wave of electoral victories for parties of the left across Latin America beginning in 1998 and continuing today, although the degree to which leftist agendas have varied in their attempts to break away from or remain embedded within the neoliberal framework. Support for the populist left is nonetheless symptomatic of rising levels of dissatisfaction with economic liberalism and liberal democracy, anti-imperial struggle, skepticism towards and resistance against foreign interference in national affairs are a prominent element of left-wing populism in the region given its history with colonialism. In the post-1970s era, one historically key event which sparked both the resurgence of the populist left in the region as well its anti-imperial nature and hostility to neoliberalism is the U.S.-sponsored coup and overthrow of Salvador Allende of Chile in 1973. This event has often been regarded as signaling the birth of the neoliberal paradigm in the region as well as its troubled relationship with foreign, Western powers. Anti-imperial struggle with the overthrow of Allende regime and the establishment of the brutally repressive and authoritarian Pinochet regime, Chile became the first country in the region to act as the laboratory for the implementation of the neoliberal agenda. During this period, leading Chicago school economists known as the Chicago Boys crafted the economic agendas of the Pinochet regime. Widespread privatization of the country's formerly nationally owned resources, deregulation of industries, and opening up the economy to foreign direct investment, FDI, i.e. the policy regime of the Washington Consensus. The role of international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF and structural adjustment programs are also important given that criticisms of these institutions became a central component of the agendas of the populist left in the region during this period. The struggle for indigenous rights. The struggle for indigenous rights is rooted in the region's colonial past and the institutionalization of exploitative and racially based hierarchies imposed by Spanish and Portuguese colonizers, which have had lasting effects on both the treatment and livelihoods of the region's indigenous populations. Indigenous people have historically been excluded from the national political affairs of countries in the region, and it is since the 1990s that large-scale indigenous social movements have erupted and have demanded the rights of sovereignty and self-determination. In the modern era, indigenous protest movements have achieved various degrees of success in having their demands met and by increasing the extent to which they have become represented within national politics. It has often been through the populist left, e.g. in Bolivia, that such movements have found more success in the political realm. The Latin American left in the post-neoliberal era. One unique aspect in which left-wing populists have governed in the region is their varying approaches to both accepting and rejecting aspects of the neoliberal model of economic governance. In particular, three types of economic policy regimes have been implemented by these actors according to Levitsky and Way, 2011. Orthodox regimes, statist regimes, heterodox regimes. Orthodox regimes are characteristic of the economic model in Brazil implemented under Lula da Silva and the Workers' Party, PT. These regimes are those that most closely adhere to the principles of neoliberalism in their commitment to policies such as privatization and trade liberalization, but that also make substantive investments in social policies aimed at reducing inequality, e.g. Bolsa Familia. Statist regimes are characteristic of the economic model in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez. These regimes are characterized by high levels of state control of the economy and policies, including the nationalization of major industries, the creation of state-run firms, high regulation of FDI, and investments in social policy. Lastly, heterodox regimes such as those under Rafael Correa in Ecuador engage in both orthodox and statist measures. The varieties of left populist rule in the region in the 21st century have also differed in their models of democratic governance. One such model is that of the liberal democratic regime where pluralism is institutionalized, e.g. Brazil. A second model is radical democratic regimes which combine pluralism with new channels of popular participation, e.g. Bolivia. Lastly, a third model is the plebiscitarian regime in which leaders make direct appeals to the population in order to bypass institutional rules, concentrate power in their own hands, and undermine political opponents, e.g. Venezuela. Democracy and the populist left in Latin America. The contemporary populist left movement in Latin America is characterized by a commitment to the expansion of democratic rights and participation and is characterized by a sense of dissatisfaction with the state of democracy in the region. Several important factors contribute to this dissatisfaction. Panizza and Mirelli 2009. The institutional fragility of the democratic order as evident in the weakness of the rule of law, rampant corruption, the politicized nature of the state, the lack of transparency and accountability, and the discrediting of representative institutions. The appeal of left-wing populism in the region can be understood with reference not only to economic injustices, but also a desire to break free from the political status quo and establish a new inclusive participatory model that extends beyond the economic realm. However, an important element of left-wing populism in the region is that it has been more likely to tend towards authoritarianism in some cases. Part of this trend is rooted in the region's history, which has been marked by both military dictatorships as well as highly personalist regimes, as well as the legacy of colonial institutions, which have led to the path-dependent development of authoritarian rule. Discussion questions. Would you agree with Chantal Moufet's assertion that we are currently living in a populist moment where a crisis of representation is increasingly likely to push voters towards populist alternatives? They are appealing because of their simple language. Do you agree that there is an inherent trade-off in attempting to appeal to the so-called losers and winners of globalization? Can left-wing populism successfully appeal to both groups? It can happen, but unknown why. Although both European and Latin American left-wing populism have been concerned with the expansion of democratic rights and participation, which factors do you think best explain why left-wing populism in Latin America is more radical in nature? Summing up, Chantal Moufet's conception of left-wing populism. Populist movement as a response to post-democracy and neoliberal hegemony. Left populism as a force for democratization and inclusion. Common features among the populist left. Rejection of neoliberalism. Response to party system crisis. Crisis of representation. Response to rising ties between political and economic factions. Social movements responding to shocks crises. Defining left-wing populism. Movement for democratic expansion and social justice. Major characteristics of left populism. Transversality beyond left-right dichotomy. Inclusivity and pro-pluralism. Expansion of participation. Historic roots of left-wing populism and socialism. Rise of left-wing populism in Europe, decline of social democratic parties and rise of Third Way, fall of communism, rising EU integration, prevalence of economic shocks, 1990s and 2008, the contemporary populist left in Europe. New historical bloc. Attempt to salvage supplant social democracy. The people as a broad tent. Inclusionary populism. Common features of populist left in Europe. New left-wing alternative. Counter to right-wing populism. Adoption by a mainstream left. Charismatic leadership. Movement parties, supporters of the European populist left. Globalization cleavage. Young, educated, urban voters. Rise of populist politics in Latin America. Wave 1, 1929-1960s ISI era. Wave 2, 1990-1998 neoliberal era. Wave 3, 1998 present 21st century socialism era. Historical roots of left-wing populism in Latin America. High inequality. Rejection of Washington consensus and entrenchment of electoral politics. Weakening of center-right parties. Re-emergence of the left after the Cold War. Anti-imperialism. Indigenous rights. The Latin American left post-neoliberalism. Orthodox states. Status states. Heterodox states. Democracy and left-wing populism in Latin America. Mainly focused on economic democracy. Also expansion of participatory institutions.